Well, isn't this typical? I spend weeks editing and writing scripts. I record about 45 minutes worth of detailed discussion about what talents I'd put where and why. I lovingly crafted my ideal class talent tree and spec talent tree in Paint, and then Blizzard comes out with some detailed Death Knight and Druid talent trees that render several of my assumptions moot. Now, I actually like the vast majority of what I see in Blizzard's release. I especially like how they're going in-depth about their priorities and design philosophies. We need more of that kind of communication from Blizzard. I also see that Blizzard did a better job with some of their design philosophies and priorities than I did. That being said, I think my first iteration of Paladin trees, if they received a few adjustments and a lot more fleshing out and additions, especially of passives and more placement of Shadowland talents, then these could actually be good enough to be in-game, and I do have a few good original ideas in them. I'd say the thing I'm most proud of is the wraparound concept for class trees. I saw that there were columns in the Druid class tree that synergized Balance and Restoration, some that synergized Restoration and Guardian, and some that synergized Guardian and Feral, but none that synergized Balance and Feral, even though those are the two DPS specs for Druids. I figured, instead of being a flat, two-dimensional rectangle, this should have wraparound geometry, and it should be scrollable. In the case of my Paladin talent tree, you might notice that I have two different and identical protection columns in blue, with Hammer of the Righteous at the top, Blessing of Protection right below it, Ardent Defender a ways past halfway, and Holy Wrath at the deepest part. Now, I didn't draw any arrows between talents in this tree because I made the decision to focus only on active abilities instead of passives in the class talent tree, which meant I didn't have enough talents for arrows to make sense. But if I had put arrows in there, you'd see that Protection could connect to Retribution and to Holy. Retribution could connect to Holy and Protection, and Holy could connect to Protection and Retribution. And there's a slider at the bottom so the player can change which columns are in the center and which one is at the edge where it can be seen twice. I think this is a really good innovation which could help Blizzard going forward, and I'm crossing my fingers they have a chance to use it for Dragonflight. And failing that, I hope at least that the devs like the idea and are planning to use it for the next expansion that comes after Dragonflight, which I suspect will be called Storm, Earth, and Fire, but that's a whole different video. Actually, I could yak quite a bit about what I put in the protection column alone. The Hammer of the Righteous was there, right at the shallowest point, because I wanted Retribution and Holy to be able to pick it up so they'd have a multi-target melee Holy Power Generator ability if they wanted it. Ardent Defender is basically Divine Protection plus a cheat death mechanic, so I figured it would work decently in the class tree, though in earlier drafts I did say we could have Divine Protection in the class tree with passives in the Protection spec tree that add the cheat death effect to it. As for the deepest talent in the Protection column, that is Holy Wrath, and oh boy. Holy Wrath has had so many different icons. It had an Exorcism icon from Vanilla to Wrath of the Lich King. It had the Denounce icon during Cataclysm. It had two golden swords crossed during Mists and Warlords. And then the Vindication icon in Legion when it became a Retribution talent. For those of you who don't know, Holy Wrath was a short-range AoE damage spell on a 9-second cooldown that Protection used from Cataclysm up until Warlords to generate threat on targets. I unpruned Holy Wrath because, well, I wanted something exciting in the deepest part of Protection's column, and damage abilities seemed to me to look the most exciting. I felt like Avenger's Shield belonged at the root of the Protection spec talent tree, and there were no other uniquely Protection damage abilities, so I decided to unprune one. Personally, I feel like Holy Wrath is a supplement rather than a staple, so maybe putting it this deep in Protection's column is a good idea after all. You can tell, I used the primary colors blue, red, and yellow for the Protection, Retribution, and Holy columns respectively, and I used the secondary colors for the columns in between the spec columns. The gray area, way over on the left, was an idea I had that was, as it turns out, inferior to Blizzard's idea. I figured there were some spells that were too simple and that lacked flavor that was specific to any one spec, to the point where they didn't really belong in any one column in the class tree, or even between any two columns. For Paladins, such spells include Cleanse Toxins, Divine Steed, Repentance, Most Auras, Redemption, and some Blessings and Greater Blessings, maybe even Divine Shield. For druids, these kinds of things include Revive, Aquatic Form, Travel Form, Mark of the Wild, Flight Form, Bear and Cat Form, and probably several other things I haven't even thought of. Now, my solution to what to do with these abilities was to create an area in the class talent trees that was outside the wraparound talents, where, regardless of spec, players could spend points to get these neutral-ish abilities. Blizzard's solution, by contrast, is to give those abilities to players for free. I stupidly assumed that Blizzard would never give us an ability past level 10 without costing us a talent point. I was wrong, and I am glad that I was wrong. Blizzard still allows some abilities to be on our spell bars without spending points to get them, even if they're learned past level 10. So most of what I had in the gray bar area was dumb, at least insofar as I'd figured that we'd need to spend points to get them. If I change the meaning of the sidebar so it just means these come from leveling for free, then it's not so dumb, I suppose. Though even with that meaning change, there are things that I would move in there. It turns out you can have talents in the talent tree that have no prerequisites other than to have spent enough points in the class tree in general. And in fact, druids have that for their Wild Charge and Tiger Dash octagonal choice talent right in the middle of their tree. It actually fills me with so much hope to see a talent like that with no prerequisites. That's actually really, really good design, since it lets just about any druid grab the talent if they so desire. My original draft had a whole section where I chewed Blizzard out just for plopping talents that don't fit in any one spec more than any other in the middle between Resto and Guardian. But with this no prerequisite feature in place, I no longer think that this is so terrible, though some part of me thinks Renewal and Barkskin belong in between the Guardian and Resto columns, where Renewal more or less already is. Anyhow, back to Paladins. I figure Repentance and Blinding Light should be moved into the class tree as a non-prerequisite talent somewhere in the middle so any Paladin can get it. In the middle vertically, since with a horizontally ramping talent system, there is no middle horizontally. As for Avenging Wrath, I had toyed with the idea of placing it in the orange column between Retribution and Holy, since those specs get more out of Avenging Wrath than Protection does. Speaking of the orange column, it comes as no surprise to my regular viewers that I have Denounce in the tree and fairly shallow in it too. I mean, there's no two ways about it. Having a damage ability with no cooldown is way more fun than having no damage ability with no cooldown. Plus, Denounce would just look amazing with the spellbook casting animation that Paladins have these days. The way we wave our hand out in the direction of our target is just begging to have a projectile spell added to it. Now, I put Denounce in between Retribution and Holy because I wanted it to be skippable for Holy Paladins who weren't interested in it, and as a damage ability with a lot of casterish flavor, it felt like in between Retribution and Holy was the most logical place. Plus, its shallowness in the class tree lets Retribution or Protection Paladins get it if they need it for some kind of edge case. Now, you might notice I didn't draw any arrows in between talents in this original draft. That's because the arrows would get drawn to and from passive talents, and I just wasn't bothering with passives, at least not unless they were in the Holy Spec tree, and even then, I didn't have enough of the passives to really draw any arrows. So I just didn't bother with the arrows. My thinking is that as game-changing as passives can be and often are, active abilities are the foundation upon which the passives are built, so I should focus on the actives first. Now, I think the biggest mistake I made in the class tree was where I placed Divine Storm at the deepest part of Retribution's column. Really, based on Blizzard's discussion about how they want to make it as difficult as possible for a player to intentionally create a broken kit for themselves, I'd say I should have put Divine Storm really shallow in the Retribution column instead. Now, some part of me is saying Divine Storm should have been in the Retribution spec tree, but I think Divine Storm and Templar's Verdict can do more good in the class tree than in the Retribution spec tree. Allowing Protection and Holy Paladins to pick those up would allow them to get their hands on nice, sustained multi-target and single-target DPS respectively. Those would be great for all kinds of solo content. Shield of the Righteous has its positive aspects, but its damage is so low that it's actually less than our Holy Power builders, and that does not feel satisfying. Of course, buffing Shield of the Righteous's damage to the point where it deals significantly more damage than our Holy Power builders would be another decent alternative to putting Divine Storm in the class tree. But it feels a little more fun to have Divine Storm in the class tree, and as you can tell, I was prioritizing the fun factor. Plus, let's face it, some Holy Paladins want to wield a two-handed weapon instead of a shield. Before I talk about the Holy Column, I'd like to discuss what I did at the very deepest parts of the class tree. I saw that Druid's deepest class talents weren't in the Balance, Restoration, Guardian, or Feral columns themselves. They were in between those columns. I assumed that every class talent tree would have its deepest talents in between the Specs columns, until I saw the Death Knight talents, that is. Then I realized my assumption wasn't correct. That being said, I was proud of what I came up with for Holy in these in-between deepest talents. I created an actual meaningful choice between two powerful passives. Conviction was an old Cataclysm talent that provided a stacking damage and healing buff whenever you crit, and it used to be a Retribution talent called Vengeance. So I put that in between Holy and Retribution as a kind of an ultimate, and set the numbers so that it maxes out at a 6% buff to damage and healing. Then in between Holy and Protection, I pulled a Wrath of the Lich King and Cataclysm talent called Divinity, which increases both healing received and healing dealt by 5%, and yes, that means you can double dip on benefiting from this talent while self-healing. If you do a lot of self-healing as a Holy Paladin or use Light of the Martyr a lot, then Divinity is probably better. If not, Conviction is probably better. But I struggled to find something similar I could put in between Retribution and Protection that would provide similar meaningful choices for both Retribution and Protection players. I defaulted to Divine Strength, an old-school Holy talent, ironically enough, that flat-out boosted Strength by 5%. While both Protection and Retribution benefit from Strength, I strongly suspect that doesn't really provide a meaningful choice for either of them. Anyhow, back to Holy's column in the class tree. You can tell I started with Holy Shock and Beacon of Light. Shallow in the Specs column where fundamental spec-defining abilities belong, but I think I should say why I put Beacon in the class tree instead of the Holy Spec tree. I'd wanted to modify Beacon so that either damage or healing gets copied to your beaconed target as heals. That's about the only way you'll ever get a Retribution Paladin to heal anyone. Unless you implement Selfless Healer as something that doesn't cost any Holy Power or any global cooldowns, since spending global cooldowns or, light forbid, Holy Power on something that isn't damage is pretty much unthinkable with today's culture. Though with that context in mind, it should probably be called something other than Selfless Healer. Anyhow, without this change to Beacon so that it works off of both damage and healing, Beacon would belong at the base of the Holy Spec tree. As it is, I put Light of Dawn at the base of the Holy Spec tree, and without Beacon's changes, I would just switch those two talents places. But I'll talk about the Holy Spec tree in my next video. I put Holy Shock in the class tree for the same reason I put Denounce there. I figured it could do more good for other specs, in that Protection can make use of a self-heal that generates Holy Power, and Retribution can probably find some useful edge cases where another ranged Holy Power generator is useful too. Lay on Hands felt like it was a powerful enough snap button to belong deeper in Holy's column, and I actually put Lights Hammer at the deepest part of Holy's column because I wanted to put something exciting there, and similar to how Wild Growth is deep in Restoration's column, I figured that AoE healing would be one of the most interesting things I could put in the deepest part of Holy's column, and something that deals damage is more interesting than something that doesn't deal damage, and that's basically why I picked Lights Hammer. That covers what I wanted to talk about in my ideal Paladin class talent tree. Again, it's very much incomplete, but I figure getting something out there for players to discuss and for Blizzard to see is wise. In my next video, I'll talk about what I did in the Holy Spec tree.